Hi, my name is Gibson, and I'm the creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and in this video, I want to talk to you a little bit about how I learned to regulate my nervous system and really what it did for me and why it matters. So this is part of a little series I'm doing on more personal shares on this channel. And one of the big things I wanted to talk about that was a really powerful lesson for me as an individual is nervous system regulation. So I learned about nervous system regulation work after I'd already done a whole bunch of different things in terms of healing. I'd already done a lot of reprogramming, learned quite a bit about my needs. And at the time as well, in fairness, I was also like a pretty avid meditator, and meditation obviously has a huge impact on your nervous system regulation. But I wasn't really aware of like what my sort of nervous system set point was and why this mattered so much. So I had begun meditating, and I would sort of meditate every morning at this point. And I started to read more about like nervous system regulation as a whole and how it affects your immune system function and all these different things. But for those of you who are not familiar, we basically have two nervous system states, and they are mutually exclusive. So you can't really be in both at the same time. So one is sympathetic nervous system mode, and one is parasympathetic. When you are in parasympathetic nervous system mode, you feel like you are in rest and digest mode. You are in peaceful mode generally a lot more of the time. You can still be affected negatively by things in that state, but you're not in this like upregulated fight or flight type of response. Sympathetic nervous system mode is your fight and flight mode specifically. And generally, the more that you are in this mode, the more reactive you're likely to be, the more exaggerated your responses are likely to be, the more you may experience emotional volatility, the more you'll even like find yourself probably making mountains out of molehills. Like if you're in parasympathetic mode and there's a problem in your life, like you got a parking ticket or something, you're like, oh, I got a parking ticket. That's unfortunate. That's frustrating. How will I solve for the problem? When you're in sympathetic nervous system mode, things just seem so much bigger because you're already in this like protection, preservation kind of mode. And, you're more likely to feel a lot more emotionally distressed when you're already in fight or flight mode. So there's something called polyvagal theory, and it's the work of Dr. Stephen Porges. And it's basically the idea is that we can actually regulate what nervous system function we're in at will through practice and through a little bit of training. And there's a whole bunch of other people that study this and put information and research out into the field. And the idea is that, or what research will also tell us, is that people who have a history of more trauma also more easily go into fight or flight mode. And they enter it into it more quickly. They'll stay there for longer. And if we're constantly in fight or flight mode, it's also harmful long-term, right? To our health, to our well-being. It'll be correlated with an excess production of cortisol, norepinephrine. And so all of these things can have a negative impact on our immune system response. And one of the biggest things that I felt was so important when I was starting to learn about some of these things is like, oh, not only do I like feel like things are a bigger deal when I'm in this sympathetic nervous system mode, but I also like am more likely to feel unsafe, which was really interesting for me. So I am unsafe as a big core wound. And a lot of people who struggle with chronic anxiety, fear, have that big core wound. And then they'll try to do reprogramming around that core wound. And it may help a little bit, but unless we're actually in parasympathetic state a lot more of the time, we won't feel like we're really like safe in our bodies overall. So something interesting when I was starting to read and research about these things and learn about these things sort of in reference to my own healing, my own journey, was that you're seeing all these different dynamics play out. You're seeing this body of work and research come out. And I started paying attention and being like, oh, it's interesting. I'll start my day and I'll meditate. And then I'll have a really peaceful morning. And then by lunchtime, and I was about like maybe 2 years into doing a lot of self-work at this point. So this is like 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe, when I was deep diving into more of this stuff. And I was realizing that, oh, I see these things and I start off peacefully. And then like throughout the day, I slowly kind of like devolve back into being more in sympathetic nervous system mode. Now, prior to doing a lot of other work for that past 2 years at the time, I had really struggled. I probably spent most of my waking time in sympathetic nervous system mode. I was like constantly like on high alert, even in like a good way. So like even if I was doing something that I enjoyed, I was like doing it in sort of this like sympathetic nervous system mode type of way. And I realized like, wow, now that I'm meditating in the morning, that's helping me. But then I go through my whole workday. I come home and I get home and I'm like exhausted. And then I go into this like almost like burnout mode. Like I wasn't necessarily in a burned out space at the time, but I would just go into like, that's it mode. Like I think at the time I'd go to work, come home, go to the gym, get home from the gym, and then just like, feeling exhausted. Like I just need to like lay and not move. And I realized like that's because I'm operating at such an intense mode for so long in the day that by the time those like intense responses are out of the way and I start feeling rested, it's almost like my body is like overcompensating for that. And I'm going into this kind of like exhaustion mode, and it's hard to like get back up and like have a good evening and like do things that I feel are empowering me in my life, my growth. So I started deciding that I was going to intentionally re-regulate when I would get home. And it would be my way of like trying to practice training, from sort of the body of work of like Dr. Stephen Porges, and practice like getting into parasympathetic mode when I got home. And I would do this through either meditating or I developed this habit, and it sounds so funny, but it makes such a big impact. And it's that I would go into my room and I would turn off all electronics. Like I wouldn't have my phone near me, or I would turn it off. I wouldn't have like a television on or a computer app or open. And I would just practice for like 20 minutes being. Like I would just practice like no external output, not in this like mode of like going, doing, but actually getting into this mode of like just learning to actively relax and downregulate. And I wanted to like finish my busy day and my busy life and come home and then be able to reset and be in parasympathetic nervous system mode. And what I would find a lot, so I would go into my bed and I would just turn everything off and I would just practice like being with myself, like feeling what it felt like to be inside of my body, like feeling inside of my toes and inside of my feet, and feeling sort of the energy moving up and down my legs and stomach, and what it felt like to take deep breaths, and just trying to like get back into really my body a little bit and get back into like rest mode a little bit. And what I would find over and over again is that I'd be really tired for the first 10 minutes of it, like trying to make sure I didn't fall asleep, because you have to stay awake for this to work. And then I would find that sort of the last 10 minutes, it was almost like I got a second wind. Like, oh, this sort of energy kicks back up again. And, I would feel this sort of second wind, but not this like upregulated distress second wind, not this like, oh, get back into fight or flight mode, all these things I have to do and like all these things to check off a list, but instead more of just this like presence, like this like better energy. And it felt like grounded and stable and consistent. And then I could go do my evening and I could be like, what do I want to do this evening? What makes me feel like it's going to fill my needs? Like, do I want to hang out with a friend, or do I want to, chat on the phone with somebody, or do I want to learn about something or read a book? And I would be able to do it in a fully present way. Whereas prior to practicing this, I found that I would come home and maybe like the most I could do, I was like always learning about personal growth at the time, but the best I could do was like watch a video or like watch part of a course online or something like that, and be like barely present and kind of like dazing out. And what I learned after the fact is that, it's because I was so in this re-regulated state. And then I also saw like different things people would do, right? And I'm sure I'd done that like a few years before I'd done deeper inner work. But I saw in my practice over time later on that there's all these different ways that we try to regulate ourselves and don't necessarily realize that that's what we're doing. So we're trying to like get into parasympathetic when we can't properly downregulate. And all the different ways people do it, I mean, a lot of it's like numbing oriented, right? A lot of it's like you feel restless and dysregulated and you don't know how to relax. And so you like binge watch television, or you eat a bunch of food, which is actually there as a mechanism for people to like, you hear in like eating disorder communities, the idea of stuffing, where you're like trying to stuff down and suppress your feelings. But I also saw in my practice that a lot of this is people trying to get really full so they can stimulate almost like a feeling of fatigue so they can actively downregulate. And you see that with people drinking when they get home from work. Oh, have a few beers or have a few glasses of wine or whatever, all these like adult normal things, but that are actually depriving us of being able to effectively regulate our nervous system response in relationship to ourselves. And then forcing us, in a sense, to have to rely on these like habits or crutches as a way of doing that, that may have strong downsides, right? Like there are strong downsides to having to regulate through alcohol, right? Or having to regulate through binge watching television and ignoring yourself for hours, or not checking in with yourself, or being able to like introspect about your life, or make a plan for tomorrow, or do the laundry, or things because you're just feeling so exhausted, or you're doing all these things to actually create that exhaustion so that you can relax. And so it was so interesting to see like all the difference in my life where I would like, instead of just like being so exhausted when I would get home from my day, how I could go participate in my evening and have a second wind and be like, okay, what do I want to do with the next couple hours before I go to bed? And have some like actual intentional time to invest in things that filled my cup back up, my buckets back up, my needs buckets basically. And then would allow me the next day to go into work feeling recharged, to start my day on the right foot. And so by having this like active mechanism to practice that when I got back, totally life changing, like literally totally life changing. And if I was tired and didn't feel like I had energy to do something in my life midday or whatever it would be, I would try to just go take time to go regulate. And over time, what happens is we get more used to and accustomed to being in parasympathetic nervous system mode than sympathetic, because it becomes part of like our programming, right? If I'm starting by meditating in the day and I'm regulated for the first few hours, and then I shift out of that, but then a couple hours later, I'm back in that mode when I get home, and I'm practicing that, I'm building out more of a subconscious comfort zone around being in parasympathetic mode. And then there will be times where you have like pressure or stress or something to do, or you're late or whatever it could be for something, and you'll upregulate, and that's totally fine. But it's very valuable to notice what system function you're in, right? To be able to go, oh, I can tell that I'm a little upregulated, and like I'm gonna have to re-regulate after this, or things like that. And it's very, very valuable long-term to prevent burnout, to stay in your body. I find that people who are constantly in sympathetic nervous system mode, there is a correlation, not all and not cause, but there's a pattern, a correlation of people as well who will also be in like subtle states of dissociation, and really kind of like removed from their body and what it feels like to be grounded in your body, be able to be in touch with your feelings in real time. And our feelings are pointing us at all times towards our needs, our boundaries, like they're showing us to ourselves. And if we're not able to even receive that information because we're dissociated and dysregulated, I mean, there's tremendous downsides to that. So learning to properly get into relationship to yourself that way is very valuable. And then having that proper energy that's rooted and grounded, where you can be present with yourself and actually go be intentional with your time. Because you'll find, right, when you're dysregulated, and then when you try to numb that feeling out or try to suppress to get into downregulated mode, like let's say you binge eat a bunch of food to try to get into parasympathetic nervous system mode, then you're in a state of coping. Or same thing with wine or beer or whatever it is, like a substance, whatever it is, you're just in the state of like coping and surviving and existing, rather than actually being able to be intentional about, oh, here I am, I'm in my body, I'm in my life, I'm present. Now what would I like to do that's going to feed the highest expression of myself? And it's really hard to do that when you're just in this autopilot mode, right? Of just like trying to cope with your nervous system function, in the way that your subconscious mind knows how, which is through these habits that often have strong downsides. So by learning to regulate your nervous system function in a healthy, proactive way, it will give you a second wind, and then also allow you to feed yourself and nurture yourself in ways that have the most upsides rather than the most downsides attached to them. So this was life-changing for me. This is a habit I still practice on a very regular basis, a little bit less so now because I find I need to rely on it quite a bit less, but something that I nonetheless will do, like after a really busy day or things like that. And something that will actually change your set point of where you're used to operating from. And also, if you want to check this out, I have a course all about this that you can check out for free for 7 days, called Nervous System Regulation, or Somatic Processing and Nervous System Regulation. And it's all about like how to understand this, how to properly regulate your nervous system, different hacks and tools and habits. There's many different things that you can do. I think there's like 10 major suggestions in that course, and you can sort of pull from a couple and decide what you can see yourself really doing, that will benefit you the most. So hopefully this makes sense. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, you can check out that course for 7 days for free, all about nervous system regulation, using the link below. And I will see you in the next video. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much.